Start the recording. That is loud. Well, welcome, Andy. Welcome. So I'm gonna call your name occasionally. But thanks for joining. This is the City of Garden Grove scoping meeting for there's a general plan update, but it's a focused update. The city is updating the housing element, safety element, land use element, and environmental justice element. Andy, I'm going to share my screen. I don't know if you're going to be able to see it or not. Are you on a, actually, well, I'll ask you, can you see the screen, Andy?
Sorry, I was clicking mute. Yeah, I could see the screen.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
All right, then we'll just kind of go through the presentation pretty brief here. Let me double check to see if we got anyone else waiting. Kent, if you don't mind, just kind of occasionally check. Oh, let me make you a co-host. But if you can check to see if anyone else is in the waiting room, we can let them in. All right, with that, I'll get started. My name is Jose Rodriguez, and I am a consultant with MIG. And we're, as I mentioned, we're assisting the city update the Garden Grove General Plan, specifically the housing element, the land use element, preparing a new environmental justice element, and the safety element. I'm going to also introduce Kent Norton, who's also with MIG, and he's actually, his team is preparing the environmental impact report and doing the environmental documentation for the general plan update. Andy, since you're the, oh, and here comes Maria. She's also city staff person. Andy, since you're the only person, we'll kind of keep this meeting a little informal. If you have any questions or comments, why don't you go ahead and feel free to interrupt me. You can raise your hand. I'm checking the participants list, or if you want to unmute and just kind of say, hey, I have a, Jose, I have a question. We can entertain any questions or comments you have through the meeting and presentation.
Okay, sure thing, thanks.
The meeting agenda. So we want to talk about the purpose of this meeting. I want to briefly go over the project overview. I kind of mentioned the documents, but I'll provide a little bit of detail of what those documents mean and why the city is updating those documents. And then the purpose of CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act. What does that mean? So we'll talk, Kent will provide a little bit of background information on that. And then the purpose of this meeting also is to hear comments from the community and the public about these documents and the environmental impact report. All right, so let me go over the meeting purpose. Again, as I mentioned, purpose of the meeting is to talk about the project, to give an overview, and then we really want to solicit the comments from the community, from the public. Regarding the environmental analysis, we're also, this is where there's a period here where we're noticing public agencies, the public, the community, surrounding cities, that the city is preparing an environmental impact report to address those documents I talked about. And then again, we want to make sure that we hear the community, and that if there's any particular topic area or focus that the environmental team should be looking at in closer detail, we want to have an opportunity for the public to identify those as well. All right, so let's go over the project. Let's talk about the project overview. All right, as I mentioned, the city is currently updating its housing element. That's required by state law. Typically, housing elements are updated about every 8 years. It has to get certified or reviewed by the state. It's the Housing and Community Development Department at the state. They're responsible for certifying the housing element. And the key component of the housing element is obviously making sure that the city is able to accommodate existing and future housing needs, providing safe, decent housing for the community at different income levels. The state does identify a number of housing units. All the cities in the Southern California, in fact, all of California, have to accommodate this cycle. For the 6th cycle, Garden Grove's gotten actually a big chunk of housing units that it has to accommodate. Now, the city doesn't have to build them. They have to be able to accommodate them through their land use and zoning laws. So the number of units the city is responsible for is about 19,000 units over the next 8 years. So that's the number that the housing element is targeting. The land use element is also being updated because part of state law, general plans have to be consistent with each other. So those 19,000 units, the land use element also has to be able to identify and show that there is space for those 19,000 units. Also part of state law is there's some new requirements. A couple of them, one of them is focusing on environmental justice. If a city has been classified as a disadvantaged community, where there's an area or a neighborhood that has high pollution burdens, some social economic challenges, there's some state statistics at a geographic level that has a threshold to determine whether there's a disadvantaged community, then the city has to prepare an environmental justice element. And Garden Grove does have some disadvantaged communities. Even if it didn't, the city has the option to prepare an environmental justice element. But if they do have those disadvantaged communities, they are required by the state to prepare that element. So we're updating that element or preparing a new element at this time. The safety element is a focused update, and it's primarily targeting climate adaptation, the increase in climate change, warmer climates, and this is kind of more of a 20-year outlook, making sure the cities in Southern California are prepared to address wildfires, sea level rise, or in the case of Garden Grove, maybe it's increased heat, warmer nights, warmer days, drought conditions, some of the climate change, but this is also another requirement from the state. And lastly, to tie everything up, zoning also has to be updated to be consistent with the land use element and the housing element with those 19,000 units. The zoning is an implementation tool of the general plan, so it has to make sure that it can still have the part of the accommodating those new housing units is having the tools to be able to accommodate those, and the zoning is one of the tools. Just real briefly, a general plan, what the general plan is it is a document, it's a policy document that city planning commissioners, city council use to help guide long-term planning for the city. It is a document that belongs to the community. We do a lot of community engagement. In fact, we did a lot of meetings throughout over the past year, workshops, study sessions, online surveys, really get input from the community. It's meant to be long-term, so it's addressed anywhere from 5 to 20 years into the future. The document can be changed. It's a living document. And it's also meant to be comprehensive. There's a lot of elements and they all need to be consistent. As I mentioned earlier, we're updating the housing element, land use safety, a new environmental justice element, but we're not touching the other elements that are identified here on the right: community, design, economic, and so forth. Those elements will still remain in the general plan, but those could be updated in the future, but not at this time. The draft land use plan as part of the land use element was revised again to accommodate, the previous general plan that was adopted in 2008 had about 6,000 new units. Now we're at 2020, a good, 12, 13 years later. The state, is asking the city to accommodate 19,000. So we had to make changes to the land use plan. One thing to note, where we really made the changes was along the corridors and mixed use areas. We increased the densities to accommodate those land use, those housing numbers. But many of the existing residential neighborhoods, those will still remain. There's no land use changes. There's no changes to the regulatory environment. The only changes that have been made over the last couple of years is allowing more accessory dwelling units. And that's also another requirement by the state. And you keep hearing me saying about the state's requiring this, the state's requiring this. Part of the reason the state's requiring a lot of these changes to these documents is to address the housing issues in many of the communities. The cost of housing has gone up so much. Homelessness is becoming more prevalent in our communities. So how can we help address some of those challenges? And so the state's kind of looking to cities to address them locally in these land use plans. So let's talk about build out. So what are the changes to the land use plan mean? So here in the middle where it says existing conditions, that's how many housing units, where it says dwelling units. There's about 48,000 dwelling units throughout the entire city of Garden Grove as of 2020. We wrapped up a study late last year, and we codified that 48,000 number. We're trying to accommodate that 19,000. So the build out goes up to 20,242. That's the build out change number. So that's how many new units. The number does go over that 19,000 I keep talking about, only just to give the city some flexibility, as the state has to review the housing element and they may make some changes. So the city still has to have some flexibility, either increase or decrease that number. But we want to make sure the environmental analysis reflects those housing units. Population goes up about the same amount, roughly the same unit, the same percentage. There is a lower number because we incorporated accessory dwelling units, and that has a lower number of persons per household for smaller accessory units and more multifamily type units. Non-residential building square footage, which is mostly commercial, industrial buildings, and the square footage those accommodate. You can see those numbers are really large, but there's a drop in that number. There's almost a 2% decrease over the next 10 to 15 years in building square footage, only because to accommodate those housing units, it's not being put in vacant land, because there's no vacant land in Garden Grove. There's underutilized land. There's older shopping centers that are outdated, maybe some other uses that are not meeting their full economic potential. Those areas are ripe for residential and housing uses, but that means we're taking away some of that existing commercial or office building square footage. And lastly, as I mentioned, the zoning amendment is one implementation tool for the general plan, but it also dictates how development and buildings get built in their form on property, what the setbacks are, what the heights are, and how many houses you can build on a particular property. So the things that we're changing to accommodate those 19,000 units is adjusting the densities, adding new overlays to accommodate those additional housing units, adjusting whether it's heights or the allowable square footage of building square footage, and so forth. The housing element also looks at the zoning ordinance comprehensively to see if there's any other what's called constraints to development. And so we are making some minor adjustments, again, just to make sure that the city can accommodate that 19,000. And just to reemphasize, the city doesn't build those 19,000 units. It's property owners and developers that build them. The requirement for the city is, again, they have to make sure that the zoning and the land use laws can accommodate the new housing. So that is the project overview. I am now going to turn it over to Kent to kind of talk about the environmental impact report and CEQA. So with that, Kent, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jose. You'll be controlling the presentation, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the California Environmental Quality Act of 1970 called.
Okay. Looks like there's a little bit of delay. Go ahead and try again.
Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. There. Okay. Let me know if you have any problems hearing me.
No problem.
The CEQA is an overarching environmental law in California. Instead of addressing just one aspect of the environment, it establishes a process for local agencies like the city to deal with any kind of discretionary action a city deals with, whether it's a public or private project, has to meet the requirements of CEQA. And those are to disclose environmental impacts of proposed actions to the public and the decision makers, to provide the decision makers with objective information upon which to make decisions, to identify ways to reduce or eliminate potential environmental impacts. Those are typically called mitigation measures. Another way to eliminate or reduce impacts is to have an alternative, or to analyze an alternative to a proposed project. And the other aspect of CEQA is to foster coordination or interaction between different agencies. Even though the city may be what's called the lead agency, they're in charge of the CEQA process for the general plan, for example. There are other agencies like Caltrans and the Department of Toxic Substance Control, other agencies that are interested in the CEQA process for the general plan, and they would participate at various points in the CEQA process. Next slide. So to announce to the public and to public agencies that the city is going to go through the CEQA process. In this case, they're preparing an environmental impact report, which is the most extensive environmental documentation you can prepare under CEQA. We've sent out a notice of preparation, which is essentially a declaration that the city will be preparing an EIR. It contains a brief description of the project, in this case, the general plan update. It notifies the public and agencies that an EIR will be prepared and that comments will be accepted on the scope of the EIR, what the issues and content of the EIR should be. It gives the public and the agencies basically a way to say what the most important issues to them are and what should be focused on in the EIR. So that notice of preparation is distributed for 30 days. To solicit comments from public agencies and the public as to the contents of the EIR. That public review, we are in the notice of preparation review period right now. It's running from June 30th to July 30th, and we'll talk about the schedule a little bit later. Next slide, please. So these are the 20 some odd environmental issues or topics that are typically dealt with in an environmental impact report. Everything from aesthetics to air quality, traffic, noise, greenhouse gases, cultural resources, biological resources. Even if a particular area or site, for example, does not have much of a particular resource, the document still has to describe what the potential impacts of that proposed project, in this case, the general plan update, would have on those particular resources. And next slide. And to support the analysis in the EIR, a number of technical studies are typically prepared. In this case, we're doing a traffic study, although the scope of the traffic study is a little bit different than we typically do. If you're familiar with past environmental documents or technical studies, we typically looked at congestion on local streets as the determinant of what a significant traffic impact was. The state has determined that a new metric or new measurement needs to be used, determine what the regional effect of traffic would be, and that's called vehicle miles traveled. And if you have questions about that, we can talk about that in a little bit more detail, but it's definitely changed the way that traffic impacts are looked at in environmental documents, kind of an interesting transition. Another technical study that's being done is noise and vibration. A lot of it due to the addition of traffic in a particular area. We now look at greenhouse gases for its effect on climate change, and an air quality study will help us determine if we exceed any of the thresholds established by the South Coast Air Quality Management District. Next slide, please. So other issues that are dealt with in an environmental impact report include looking at cumulative impacts. Those would be impacts of not just what is being proposed, but what might be proposed in the surrounding area that could affect in fact, have an evaluation. We look at growth-inducing impacts. Are there any aspects or physical changes that are being proposed by the project that might induce additional unanticipated growth into an area? We typically summarize the significant adverse impacts of a project. Those are those impacts that remain at a significant level even when you add mitigation measures or look at alternatives. And as I said, we look at alternatives to the, in this case, the general plan update to see if changing the land use plan, for example, has any demonstrable change to the potential impacts of the general plan update. And finally, any long-term irreversible environmental impacts that might result from implementation of the project, such as the commitment of non-renewable resources, building materials, and so forth. Next slide, please. So here's a brief outline of the schedule for our CEQA process on the general plan update. As I said, we issued the notice of preparation the end of June. The notice of preparation period runs from the June 30th to July 30th. We are having a scoping meeting because this particular project under CEQA might have a regional significance and certainly is of concern or of interest to surrounding jurisdictions. And let's see, the notice preparation period will close on July 30th, and we will then be preparing the environmental impact report, and that will be circulated in August and September. We'll be responding to comments on the draft EIR when the EIR review period closes, which is 45 days. We'll be responding to those comments in October, and with hearings scheduled at the Planning Commission and City Council both in September and October. Next slide, please. I think that's okay. And here again, if you have comments, in addition to any comments you might want to make tonight, if you have written comments you'd like to make later after reviewing the material, you can submit those to Chris Chung at the city. Here's the information. Let's see. And I think that's probably it. And this is the contact information. All of the environmental impact report information, as well as the general plan information, is and will be available on the city's website at this address. And with that, if we have any members of the public or representatives from agencies that would like to make comments.
Well, no, Maria is a city staff person. Andy, I think you're our only person. I wanted to see if you had any specific comments that you wanted to give us, and we'll take some notes if you have any. If you don't, again, as Kent mentioned, the opportunity to continue providing comments is up to July 30th, and I do recommend going on the city's website. So you have that opportunity. But any questions or comments, Andy, that you wanted to share with the team?
Yeah, no, so far so good. Yeah, just listening in and yeah, nothing so far. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Oh, Andy, just a quick question. Are you a resident or live in the surrounding community, just out of curiosity?
Yes, I'm actually, I'm the CEQA planner with the city of Anaheim.
Oh, excellent.
Just,
Okay.
yeah, I'm just sitting in and, you know,
Okay.
agency, just,
No, appreciate it. No, just out of curiosity. Since you're the only person, I get to pick on you a little bit. Yeah, and you I don't know. Yeah, again, any questions or comments? Yeah, feel free to send it to. I'll put that back up to Chris Chung, and I don't know. You may have Chris is on the line. I don't know if you've run across him as a adjoining cities. But anyway, the information's there. You know, you work in city government, so you know how to access all this information. So thanks for joining. Any last comments before we leave? I think we're going to end since you're our only person.
yeah, no, if I'm all good here. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Andy, and then thanks, Kent. Thanks, city staff, and we'll move forward preparing the EIR and the other elements. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Andy, for joining. Appreciate it.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Thanks everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.